Sarah Martinez froze when she saw the blood on her neighbor's kitchen window. Through the gap in his blinds, she watched him calmly wiping his hands with a dish towel, humming a tune she recognized from the radio. The crimson stains on the glass caught the morning light like rubies, and her coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against her own kitchen floor. She had been living next to David Chun for 8 months now, ever since she'd moved into the small duplex on Maple Street after her divorce. He seemed like the perfect neighbor, quiet, polite, always ready with a friendly wave when she pulled into her driveway after long days at the insurance office. He kept his yard immaculate, never played music too loud, and had even helped her carry groceries when her back was acting up last month. Sarah had felt lucky to have such a considerate person living just 20 feet away, separated only by a thin wall and their respective driveways. But this morning was different. She had been standing at her kitchen sink, mindlessly washing dishes while thinking about her upcoming performance review when movement next door caught her eye. The angle was perfect. Her window looked directly into his kitchen, though she'd never really paid attention before. Privacy had always been something she respected, something her ex-husband had never understood. But the flash of red had drawn her gaze like a magnet, and now she couldn't look away. David moved with an unsettling calm, methodically cleaning what appeared to be a large knife. The blade gleamed as he rotated it under the running water, and Sarah's stomach lurched when she realized the water in his sink was tinted pink. He wasn't frantic or nervous. Instead, he worked with the focused efficiency of someone following a familiar routine. His shoulders were relaxed, his movements precise, and that soft humming continued as if he were simply preparing breakfast on any ordinary Tuesday morning. Sarah's mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe he'd been preparing meat for dinner. People bought large cuts of beef, didn't they? Or perhaps he'd been gardening and had cut himself, though she couldn't remember seeing any bandages on his hands when they chatted yesterday evening about the weather. Each rational thought felt forced, fighting against the growing dread that settled in her chest like a stone. She ducked below her window when David glanced toward her side of the duplex, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it through the walls. The broken coffee mug lay in sharp fragments around her bare feet, but she didn't dare move to clean it up. Instead, she crouched there on her cold linoleum floor, trying to convince herself that what she'd seen was innocent, normal, explainable. But the blood on the window told a different story. There was too much of it, and it was too fresh. The spatters followed a pattern that spoke of violence, not cooking accidents or minor injuries. Sarah had watched enough crime shows to recognize the signs, though she'd never imagined applying that knowledge to real life, especially not to. The man who brought in her packages when she wasn't home and who always remembered to ask about her elderly mother's health. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah realized she was holding her breath. The silence from next door felt oppressive, loaded with secrets she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. David had always been private. She knew almost nothing about his personal life, his job, his family. He'd mentioned working from home, but had never specified doing what. She'd assumed it was computer programming or freelance writing, something quiet and intellectual that matched his soft-spoken demeanor, now that privacy took on a sinister quality. What did she really know about the man who lived so close she could hear his television through their shared wall? What happened in his house during the long hours when she was at work? The questions multiplied like bacteria, each one more disturbing than the last. And Sarah found herself questioning every interaction they'd ever had. When she finally gathered the courage to peek above the windowsill again, David's kitchen was empty. The window had been wiped clean, the blinds pulled shut completely. Her view of his world had been severed as decisively as if he'd known she was watching. Sarah stared at those closed blinds for a long time, wondering if the blood had been real or if her imagination had finally gotten the better of her stress-frayed nerves. But deep down, in the part of her mind that had learned to trust instincts over explanations during her tumultuous marriage, she knew what she had seen was real. And more terrifying still, she suspected it wasn't the first time David Chun had cleaned blood from his kitchen window on a quiet Tuesday morning. Sarah couldn't focus on work that day. Every phone call about insurance claims felt surreal. Every conversation with colleagues seemed to happen in a distant fog. She found herself staring at her computer screen, seeing not the spreadsheets and policy documents, but David's methodical movements as he cleaned that knife. By lunch, she'd made up her mind. She had to know more about her neighbor, even if part of her desperately wanted to pretend she'd never seen anything at all. She started with the basics during her lunch break, typing David Chun's name into every search engine she could think of. Social media profiles remained mysteriously sparse, just a bare-bones LinkedIn that listed his profession as independent contractor with no company details. His Facebook hadn't been updated in over 2 years, showing only generic landscape photos and no personal information. For someone living in the digital age, David Chun seemed determined to maintain an almost ghostly online presence. The lack of information only fueled Sarah's growing anxiety. Most people her age left digital footprints everywhere, photos with friends, work updates, random thoughts shared with the world. But David had somehow managed to exist in their connected world while remaining virtually invisible. It felt deliberate, calculated, like someone who had reasons to avoid scrutiny. After work, Sarah took a different route home, driving slowly through their neighborhood while studying the houses with fresh eyes. Maple Street had always seemed safe, boring even, the kind of place where the biggest excitement was Mrs. Patterson's ongoing war with the homeowners association about her garden gnomes. But now every shadow looked suspicious, every closed curtain seemed to hide secrets. She realized how little she actually knew about any of her neighbors, how easy it would be for someone dangerous to blend into their quiet suburban routine. That evening, Sarah found herself doing something she'd never done before, deliberately spying on David. She turned off all her lights and positioned herself at her bedroom window, which offered a side view of his property. She felt ridiculous. Like a character in one of those thriller novels, She'd stopped reading after her divorce because they made her too paranoid. But the memory of that blood wouldn't leave her alone, and she needed to understand what kind of person she was living next to. For over an hour, nothing happened. David's house remained dark except for the blue glow of what she assumed was a television. Sarah was beginning to feel foolish when she heard the sound of his garage door opening. She pressed herself against the window, watching as David emerged from his garage carrying what looked like several large black garbage bags. He moved quickly but quietly, loading the bags into the trunk of his sedan with the same methodical efficiency she'd observed that morning. Sarah's mouth went dry. The bags looked heavy, bulky, and David handled them with obvious care to avoid making noise. It was nearly 10 o'clock, an unusual time for a garbage run, especially since pickup wasn't until Thursday. She watched him drive away, noting the direction he headed, then spent the next 2 hours pacing her living room and checking her phone obsessively, waiting for him to return. When David's car finally pulled back into his driveway at nearly midnight, Sarah was ready. She had positioned herself at her kitchen window again, though her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone steady. She'd convinced herself she should call the police, but what would she tell them? That her neighbor had taken out trash at an unusual hour. That she'd seen what might have been blood on his window. They'd think she was losing her mind. The next morning brought a new horror that made Sarah's blood run cold. She was leaving for work when she noticed David's garbage can sitting by the curb. Perfectly normal, except for one detail that made her stomach lurch. They were completely empty. Not just empty of trash, but scrubbed clean, smelling faintly of bleach even from several feet away. Sarah had never seen garbage cans so meticulously cleaned, and the chemical smell was so strong it made her eyes water. David appeared at his front door just as Sarah was staring at the pristine containers, and their eyes met across their driveways. His smile was the same friendly expression she'd grown accustomed to over the past 8 months, but now it felt like a mask hiding something dark and calculating. He raised his hand in their usual morning wave, and Sarah forced herself to return the gesture, though her arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" David called out cheerfully, his voice carrying the same warm tone he'd always used. "I hope you have a wonderful day at work, Sarah." The fact that he remembered her name, remembered where she worked, suddenly felt less like neighborly thoughtfulness and more like surveillance. Sarah managed a weak smile and hurried to her car, but she could feel David's eyes following her until she drove out of sight. The normalcy of their interaction made everything worse somehow. How could someone who seemed so genuinely pleasant be capable of whatever she feared he was capable of? As Sarah drove to work that morning, she realized she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She had no proof of any wrongdoing, no concrete evidence that would convince anyone else of her suspicions. But those empty, bleach-scrubbed garbage cans haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that David Chun knew exactly what she'd seen through his kitchen window. Worse yet, She was beginning to suspect he didn't particularly care if she knew, and that terrified her more than anything else. 3 days passed before Sarah saw David again, and the silence from next door felt more ominous than comforting. She had started sleeping with a chair propped against her bedroom door, checking her locks multiple times each night and jumping at every sound. The rational part of her mind kept insisting she was overreacting, but her instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong with the man who lived 20 feet away. On Friday evening, Sarah was washing dishes when she heard a woman's voice coming from David's backyard. She froze, dish soap dripping from her hands, straining to make out the words. The voice was young, maybe early 20s, and had a nervous quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. She couldn't understand what was being said, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her phone and crept toward her back door. Her small patio offered a partial view of David's yard through a gap in their shared fence, though she'd never paid attention to it before. Now, pressing herself against the wooden slats, she could see David standing near his back steps with a young woman Sarah had never seen before. The woman had long blonde hair and was wearing a waitress uniform, the kind from one of those chain restaurants downtown. The woman was crying, her body language suggesting she was either very upset or very scared. David stood close to her, one hand on her shoulder in what might have appeared to be a comforting gesture to anyone else. But Sarah noticed how the woman kept trying to step back, how David's grip seemed to tighten each time she moved. His voice was too low for Sarah to hear, but whatever he was saying was making the woman more agitated, not less. Sarah's finger hovered over the emergency call button on her phone. This felt different from her other suspicions. This was happening right now, and that woman was clearly in distress. But doubt crept in, as it always did. What if she was wrong? What if this was just a personal conversation that had nothing to do with her fears? What if David was actually trying to help someone, and she was about to destroy an innocent man's life because her imagination had gotten out of control? The decision was made for her when she heard the woman say clearly, "Please, I won't tell anyone. I just want to go home." The desperation in those words cut through all of Sarah's uncertainty like a blade. She was dialing 911 when she heard David's response, spoken in the same calm tone he used to discuss the weather. "I'm afraid that's not possible anymore." Sarah dropped her phone, and the small thud seemed to echo like thunder in the quiet evening air. Both David and the woman turned toward the fence, and Sarah realized with horror that David was looking directly at the spot where she was hiding. His expression was no longer the friendly mask she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, his face showed a cold calculation that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Sarah," David called out, his voice carrying clearly across their yards. "I know you're there. Why don't you come join us? I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Sarah grabbed her fallen phone and ran toward her front door, her bare feet slipping on the kitchen tiles. Behind her, she could hear David's back gate opening. then his measured footsteps crossing the small space between their properties. She fumbled with her door locks, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the deadbolt. The 911 operator was asking for her emergency when she finally got the call through, but Sarah could barely form words through her panic. "My neighbor," she gasped into the phone. "There's a woman. She's in danger. Please send help." She rattled off her address while pressing herself against her front door, listening to David's footsteps on her porch. He knocked gently, politely, as if he were stopping by to borrow a cup of sugar. "Sarah," came his voice through the door, still maddeningly calm. "There's really no need for all this drama. Open the door and we can discuss this like adults." The knocking continued, patient and rhythmic, while the 911 operator asked for more details that Sarah couldn't provide without revealing how much she'd been spying on her neighbor. Then the knocking stopped, and Sarah heard something that made her legs nearly give out, David's key sliding into her door lock. Somehow, impossibly, he had a key to her home. The deadbolt she'd been relying on for protection turned with a soft click, and Sarah realized that her sanctuary had never been secure at all. David had been able to enter her home whenever he wanted, had probably been inside while she was at work, had been watching and planning while she lived her life completely unaware of the danger sleeping just beyond her bedroom wall. The door opened slowly, and David stepped inside with the same casual demeanor he'd always shown. He wasn't holding a weapon, wasn't making threats. He simply stood in her doorway looking at her with what might have been disappointment, as if she'd failed some test she didn't know she was taking. "You've made this unnecessarily complicated, Sarah," he said, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "I had hoped we could continue being good neighbors, but you've proven to be far more observant than I anticipated. That's unfortunate for both of us." Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of her living room, still clutching her phone, though she'd lost the connection with 911. David made no move to approach her, instead looking around her home with the same methodical attention she'd seen him use while cleaning that knife. It was as if he were cataloging everything, making mental notes about her life, her habits, her vulnerabilities. "The police are coming," Sarah whispered, though her voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to herself. David smiled then, the same warm expression he'd used during 8 months of neighborly small talk. "Yes," he said quietly, "I'm sure they are. But I think you'll find they're going to be far more interested in what I have to tell them about you than anything you might want to share about me." The police arrived within minutes, but by then David had transformed the situation completely. When Sarah heard the sirens, she felt a wave of relief that quickly turned to confusion and then horror as she listened to David's calm, concerned voice greeting the officers at her front door. "Thank goodness you're here," David was saying, his tone heavy with worry. "I'm her neighbor, David Chen. I've been concerned about Sarah for weeks now. She's been acting very strangely, watching me through her windows at all hours, going through my garbage. Tonight she called me over, claiming there was some kind of emergency. But when I got here, She seemed completely disconnected from reality. Sarah tried to interrupt, to tell her side of the story, but her words came out in a jumbled rush that sounded hysterical even to her own ears. She told them about the blood on the window, the garbage bags, the woman in the backyard. But when the officers went to investigate, they found David's yard empty and pristine. There was no sign anyone else had been there, no evidence of any disturbance. Sometimes people going through difficult life changes can develop paranoid delusions. David explained to the officers with the kind of gentle concern that sounded completely authentic. I know Sarah went through a painful divorce recently, and she's been living alone for the first time in years. I've tried to be a good neighbor, helping with groceries and such, but I'm starting to think my kindness might have been misinterpreted. The female officer, Detective Rodriguez, asked Sarah gentle questions about her mental health, her sleep patterns, whether she'd been taking any new medications. Each question felt like another nail in the coffin of her credibility. Sarah realized with growing horror that David had orchestrated this entire scenario, had probably been planning it since the morning she'd first seen him through his kitchen window. The woman, Sarah insisted desperately. There was a young woman in his backyard. She was scared. She was crying. Ask him where she is now. But David's explanation was ready for that too. I think Sarah might be referring to my niece, Jessica. She stopped by earlier to return some money I'd lent her. She was upset about some problems with her boyfriend, but she left hours ago to drive back to Phoenix. I can give you her number if you'd like to verify. He produced his phone with the easy confidence of someone telling the truth, scrolled through his contacts, and showed the officers a number listed under Jessica, niece. Detective Rodriguez took down the information, and Sarah watched helplessly as her story crumbled under David's perfectly crafted counter-narrative. After the police left with promises to do a welfare check, but clear skepticism about Sarah's claims, she found herself alone with David again. The officers had suggested she might want to consider talking to someone about the stress she'd been under, and they'd made it clear they thought her neighbor was a patient, long-suffering victim of her paranoid delusions. "You're very clever," David said once the police car had disappeared down Maple Street. "More observant than most. But you made one crucial mistake. You assumed I was careless, that I hadn't planned for the possibility of discovery." Sarah backed toward her kitchen, looking for anything she could use as a weapon, but David made no move to follow her. Instead, he sat down on her couch as if he belonged there, crossing his legs casually and smiling that same pleasant smile that had fooled everyone, including herself, for 8 months. "The blood was chicken," he continued conversationally. "I slaughter my own poultry. It's cheaper and more humane than store-bought. The garbage bags contained old carpeting I was disposing of from a home renovation project. The woman you saw was indeed my niece, though she wasn't upset about a boyfriend. She was upset because she discovered some photographs I'd taken without her knowledge, and we were discussing how to handle that situation." Sarah's legs gave out, and she slumped against her kitchen counter. "You're lying," she whispered, but even as she said it, She could hear how David's explanations made perfect sense. How everything she'd seen could be interpreted innocently by someone who hadn't already decided he was dangerous. "Am I?" David asked, tilting his head slightly. "Or have you been so consumed with paranoia and loneliness that you've created an elaborate fantasy to make your mundane suburban life feel more exciting?" The police certainly seemed to think so. The cruelest part was that Sarah could no longer tell the difference between truth and fiction herself. David's calm explanations made her doubt her own memories, her own sanity. Had she really seen blood, or had her mind supplied sinister details to an innocent scene? Was the woman in the backyard actually distressed, or had Sarah projected her own fears onto a normal family conversation? "Here's what's going to happen," David said, standing up and smoothing down his shirt. "You're going to get some help for your obvious mental health issues. I'm going to continue being a patient, understanding neighbor who's concerned about your well-being. And if you ever spy on me again, if you ever call the police again with your paranoid fantasies, I'll make sure everyone in your life knows just how unstable you've become." He walked to her front door, then turned back with that same neighborly smile. "I really do hope you get the help you need, Sarah. It would be such a shame if your delusions got worse. Mental illness can be so unpredictable. People can become dangerous to themselves and others without proper treatment." After he left, Sarah sat alone in her living room, staring at the door he'd locked behind him with his own key. She couldn't prove anything, couldn't convince anyone, couldn't even convince herself anymore what was real and what was paranoia. David Chun had won completely, not by hiding his crimes, but by making her question whether any crimes had occurred at all. The monster next door wasn't the obvious predator she'd imagined. He was something far more terrifying. He was a master manipulator who understood that the most effective way to destroy someone wasn't through violence, but by making them doubt their own reality. And Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that she was trapped next to him forever, never knowing if she was losing her mind or if the man who brought in her packages and asked about her mother's health was slowly, methodically destroying her life one doubt at a time. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more psychological thrillers that will keep you awake at night. Share this story if it gave you chills, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever had a neighbor who made you question your own sanity? Your support helps us bring you more spine-tingling content that explores the darkest corners of human psychology.